thing?
I did.
You did? It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I
Possibly the
set
most
my alarm, but I
embarrassing
got to have another one that's about
the most embarrassing thing I've seen about hitting with a camera in a situation like that. I found it, so let's put it that way. And
So you're all comfortable, ready to
Yeah.
roll?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
folks then,
So
we're gonna let these people entertain you. Soft shoe? You're doing soft shoe?
soft shoe.
Okay, there you go, folks. Thank you for coming out for this.
Yes.
Thank you for being here.
Okay, take it away, Tate.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. Thank you, Eric Burden Beckett, for hosting us. Much appreciated. So we're here to talk about Hilary Holladay's book, Power of Adrienne Rich. And just really quickly, so Hilary and I met about a decade ago when she was writing her biography on Herbert Huncke. And I've done quite a bit of work on Beat Generation folks, put out a record of Hunkies. And then we did a centennial celebration at the Beat Museum, of which Dennis McNally was also a part, and quite a few other folks. Stayed in contact over the years, and I was really excited because as we were doing those events, she was in the process of writing this book, all the research and everything that went into it. So that's what we're going to jump into tonight. So Hilary's going to do just a little bit about Adrienne Rich.
Well, Tate, thank you. And Eric, thank you so much for hosting this event, especially on a Monday night when I know that you're not typically open. This is just a beautiful shop, and I hope I'll have time to do a little bit of browsing after our event. As for Adrienne Rich, I would say, just in case you haven't been sitting around at home thinking about Adrienne Rich all day, I thought maybe it'd be good if I just said a few words, basic words about her. Adrienne Rich was a poet with a capital P. She was born in 1929 in Baltimore to an esteemed scientist and doctor, Dr. Arnold Rich, and his wife, Helen. She was the older of two daughters, and her father had wanted a boy for his first child and had planned to educate that boy to be a genius like he was. Well, he had a little girl instead, and so he thought, I'll still do it. So he dedicated his life, in some respects, part of his life, to transforming this baby girl, Adrienne Cecile Rich, into a literary genius. He was aided and abetted by Adrienne herself because she loved language, and when her father and her mother as well wanted her to learn poetry and to learn the alphabet by writing out verses of poems, she was happy to do it, and it got poetry and the rhythms of poetry into her nervous system when she was just a very young child. And to jump forward a bit, she really dedicated her whole life to the art of poetry because she loved it, because she was so good at it, and as I was saying, because her father was pushing her to do that. She also was a woman who was at the leading edge of feminism in the mid-20th century. Her transformations moved and inspired so many women and men too. So she became a real leading activist through her writing, she was not someone who was so much marching in the streets, but through her public readings, her presentations, and the sheer power of her writing. She really was a leader of feminism, and more specifically lesbian feminism, in her middle and later years.
That's a good compendium. So it's funny because we have people in the audience as well that have written books, worked on stuff, and done deep dives, and it's something that we've both done for the things that we put out. And maybe you could just...
I can hear okay, but I don't know if everybody can, because I don't know if the mics are working.
You want me to turn up the house? Okay.
How is it back there? Is everybody okay? You good?
Okay.
You're good?
Just checking.
All right.
Thank you.
You bet. So maybe just speak a little bit about the research that went into it, the interviews and stuff, and on top of that, Rich being someone who was kind of against the biography or biographies in general, how did you reconcile writing a book on Adrienne Rich?
Well, what a cute little dog. When I first had the idea for this project, it was in 2014, and this was 2 years after Adrienne Rich had died. And I contacted Harvard, first of all, where her papers are, the Schlesinger Library, and they gave me the contact information for her middle son, Pablo Conrad, who is the representative for the literary estate. I wrote to Pablo and I said, I'm very interested in writing a biography of your mother, and I told him a little bit about my background as a scholar. He wrote back and said, well, our mother did not want a biography written based on interviews, and she wanted her work to speak for itself. And it seemed that she had envisioned that a biography, say 50 years from now, would be just fine, but not right away. And so he was polite, but it was a clear case of talk to the hand. And so I puzzled over that email, and I thought about it, and I thought, no, she's too important, and our cultural memory is so short that I think that I have to do this. And because I was not a personal friend of Rich's, in fact, although I like to think of myself as a scholar of American poetry, I was not specifically a Rich scholar. And I think in a way that worked to my advantage because I wasn't part of her circle. So I felt like, you know what, I think she's really important, and I think that it's possible that some of the context of her life will be lost if someone doesn't write a biography now. So I didn't write back immediately to her son to say that. I waited a couple years. So, with email, typically you respond pretty quickly, but in this case, I thought I'm going to hang on until I get back to this man. So I did a tremendous amount of research at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard, and it was wonderful. I live in Virginia, so I would go up for a week or as long as I could and stay at a B&B and walk over to the Schlesinger and just do a deep dive into her papers. And what is very interesting, considering that this was a woman who said she didn't want a biography, her papers were in perfect order, just waiting for a biographer. It's like some files were closed until 2020, some were closed until 2050. So you could, there you could tell there was something going on. But I certainly read everything I could at Harvard in her papers. I explored her correspondence with other prominent writers that I was able to access at other research libraries. And I pieced together a list, an ever-growing list of people I could interview, in part from her yearbooks, from her high school yearbook. She went to Rowan Park Country School in Baltimore, a girls' school. And then she went to Radcliffe, what was then the women's division of Harvard. And so I did a lot of research on, of course, just the cultural moments of her life. And I did a lot of research on her late husband, Alfred Conrad. So it was a combination of library research, archival research, lots of interviews, and then, of course, close reading of her work itself.
I know.
I don't want to interrupt, but did you get a sense that there was anything really critical that still intrigues you, that you weren't able to access because it was not available to you at this time?
It's, of course, that it's hard to say.
Yeah.
I think that the story that I was able to write is pretty complete. I'm sure there would be details that might subtly shift the narrative, but I felt comfortable with what I had, in large part because of the interviews. If I hadn't spoken to anyone, if I'd only worked from the archives themselves, I would be more nervous, thinking, I wonder what I missed. I wonder what she held back.
Well, face-to-face human communication is so critical, isn't it?
It sure is, yes.
Oh, oh, Ryan. And I should have said as we started, we're going to speak, roughly about 30, 40 minutes, and then we are going to open it up for questions from the audience. So I had shown Hilary this yesterday. I had mentioned I had it. It's a reading that Rich gave at Stanford, and I knew who the folks were from the biography, and it was people that you'd mentioned that unfortunately didn't want to speak about her, respecting the privacy of that. But I was wondering what sort of stuff didn't make it into the book that you wished could have fit in, or, just she had such a broad life that she led, constantly reinventing herself and doing all these things. So,
well, she led such a fascinating life of self-transformation. She came out, you might say she came out as a woman in her early middle age, because for many years the poems she wrote were from what used to be called a universal point of view, which is to say a male point of view. Mm-hmm. And then she decided in the 60s and going forward that wasn't going to work anymore. So she started presenting herself in her verse as a woman, the woman she was, and then she came out successively as a lesbian and as a feminist and eventually as a Jew. So I had all those transformations to work with. So I had truly a wealth of materials. And as for what I wasn't able to include or what I chose not to include, I might have written more about her three sons if I hadn't been told so explicitly that they wouldn't talk to me. So, and so I had materials where in her papers where she referred to her sons, and I did do some research on them, and I would periodically, Google them to see if there had been any changes in their lives. But I ultimately decided that I did not want to invade their privacy. And after the book came out, I did have a few people say to me, well, what about the sons? Why didn't you write more about the sons, or what happened to them? But I wanted to tread very carefully with those three gentlemen and not to push things, because I knew that I did get back to Pablo, and I told him I am writing this book. And then we had a little bit of correspondence. It increased as the time of publication drew near. And we ended up having a friendly relationship, I'm happy to report. But as for other things that I didn't use, there were a couple of instances where I corresponded with people or interviewed them where, for whatever reason, even though I might have spent a fair amount of time talking to the person or writing to the person, it just didn't quite fit. I corresponded a little bit with the poet Diane Wachowski, and she wrote me a very thoughtful letter about how her thoughts on Rich had evolved. And I just couldn't quite fit it in. And so sometimes they're just good pieces, good anecdotes that if I had taken a different approach, or if I'd wanted to write a more discursive account, I might have included those.
Excellent. And maybe speak a little bit about the time you spent in Santa Cruz, where Michelle, Cliff, and Rich ended up living.
Yes, Adrienne was married to a man named Alfred Conrad, an economist, a Harvard economist, and they lived in Cambridge for the early years of their marriage and then moved to New York City. He committed suicide in 1970. She later, not too many years after that, came out as a lesbian. She had one significant relationship with a woman that ended unhappily. And then she met a woman named Michelle Cliff. And Michelle was a copy editor at Norton, and Norton, of course, was Rich's longtime publisher. So when Michelle Cliff was assigned the job of copy editing Rich's great feminist work of Woman Born, then Michelle and Adrienne got to know each other and quickly fell in love. They first moved after being a couple for a while in New York City to Western Massachusetts. And then after a few years there, and that, let me just say, was an extraordinary time in Rich's life, those Massachusetts years. She was not particularly happy living there. The cold New England weather was really hard on her rheumatoid arthritis, from which she had suffered since she was a young woman of 22. But she wrote so much, she toured so widely, and she was at the peak of her powers in the early 80s when she was living in Massachusetts. What happened, though, was that her health was declining to the point where I think if she and Michelle had stayed in Montague, Massachusetts, I don't think Rich would have lived into her 80s. And she had a doctor. She traveled out this way. She came out to the West Coast and met with doctors who had a more forward-looking approach. And she was really warned, you've really got to work on protect your health. You might really want to think about moving to a warmer climate. So she thought about it. She had a visiting gig at Scripps College here in California. And she went back to Massachusetts and decided that with Michelle's blessing, they would move to California. At first, they thought about Oakland, and then they hit on Santa Cruz. They moved there. They rented for a while. Then she won a large poetry award that enabled her to have the money for a down payment. And they decided to settle there, to settle in Santa Cruz. I went to visit Santa Cruz near the end of my research. I spent about 5 years working on the book. And I met with some people I had set up interviews with in advance. And it was wonderful talking to those poets and scholars. But I have to tell you that part of the real fun of that Santa Cruz trip was I met her neighbors. I wanted to see her house. And so one of the people I had an appointment with had visited Adrienne and Michelle at their home, and so she knew where it was. And so the idea was really just we would stop by, and I said, you know what, I want to knock on the door. And so I knocked on the door. No one was home, and I'm not especially extroverted, but I'm a bird dog of a reporter. And so this new acquaintance of mine was waiting in the car, and I'm sure she thought I would give up after knocking on the door of the home where Rich had lived. She, was long deceased at that point, or a few years deceased. So I went next door, knock, 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 and those people were home. And so they opened the floodgates for me because they had known Adrienne and Michelle, and they were full of recollections, and they said, they told me the names of the people who lived in Rich's old house, and they said, we'll tell them when they get home, and just come on back tomorrow. I was just like, yes, I will be back tomorrow.
That's great.
And so I did come back the following day, and the couple who lived in Rich's former home were delightful, and they had once lived in the house right behind where Rich and Cliff had lived and had known them as a couple for a long time. And they took me in, they showed me all over the house, they told me all about their contact, they showed me what they had renovated, they told me all about the property. So I talked to many, many people for this book. But there was something so wonderful about getting the insights just into Adrienne and Michelle's day-to-day life, just what they were like as neighbors. If I hadn't met these people, I never would have guessed in a million years that Adrienne Rich and Michelle Cliff liked to watch The Golden Girls. And then there were some really just sweet details. I'm thinking about one about Michelle, that she really liked the children in the neighborhood, the children of the woman who then ended up living in their home with her kids. And she told me that Michelle would do a treasure hunt for her kids, that she would hide coins in the yard, and she would make a little treasure map and then burn it around the borders to make it look antique. And and Michelle had loved Halloween. And you remember how Steve Martin would wear that cap with the arrow going through his head? So Michelle would wear that for Halloween, wait for the kids. So I got all these homey details. And this was on top of all the interviews where I had talked to wonderful scholars who had known Rich and been inspired by her, by some of her students, by her high school friends, by her college classmates. So it was part of that whole continuum of people that I had so much fun getting to know, at least a little bit, through these interviews.
Well, one thing I was hoping you would mention is, so when I told people we were doing this event, it seemed like peripherally everybody kind of had a rich story, a connection. Our friend Jason Morris worked at a bookstore in Santa Cruz where she would come in, and quite a few have come up. And you had a story on the flight out here.
Yes, I flew in yesterday from Washington, and I had a middle seat. And when you have a middle seat, the people who see you coming are just like, oh no. And the only thing worse than seeing that middle person come is having that middle person turn out to be a talker. So I thought, I will say hello to these women, and then I will be quiet for the next 6 hours. That's the least I can do for them. So I was studiously quiet, but I did have my book because I wanted to go over a few things. And so plane landed here in San Francisco, and I was all ready to get off the plane. I was holding the book, and then one of the women next to me said, so how is that book? Is it any good? And I said, well, I wrote it. And and she said, well, I had Adrienne Rich as a professor. And so I was thinking, here I was sitting next to her for 6 hours. And so I was like, so we had a brief, wonderful conversation. She told me that she had taken an introduction to poetry class with Rich at Stanford, a class of about, she said it was probably 100 students in the class. And she remembered that Rich had everyone memorize poems, at least one poem. And she still remembered the poem by Judy Grant. Is it Grant or Gran? Gran, yes. By Judy Gran. And she said at the time it was nerve-wracking for her to memorize and recite a poem, but she had done it. And she said that Rich had said, this woman had thought that Rich would say that, oh, you should memorize poetry because it's so valuable and beautiful and all that. But Rich instead had said, it's good to have some poems by heart, because then if you get stuck in traffic, you can recite them to yourself. So I started flipping through the book, and I found this passage where Rich had said that when she would drive from Santa Cruz to Stanford, that she would recite a Yeats poem to herself. And it wasn't because, it wasn't anything in particular about that poem except the rhythms of it. She said the rhythms just were useful for her. And I think the traffic could be really intense. And so I think it just calmed her. And she was trying to pass on that life lesson to her students. But I wouldn't have, that's not, that part of the story isn't in the book because I just learned it yesterday.
Which poem was it that?
It was on, let's see, let me find it.
Yeah.
I don't want to say the wrong title.
I can look.
On the
Sure.
death of the airman on the, let me see where that is.
Sorry, I can look it up.
No, it's
You talk,
Sure.
Tate, you talk. While
sure. There was somebody I wanted you to briefly talk about because he was a big part of her life. Hayden Carruth. She had a great relationship. Well, Hilary can speak about the relationship, but
I found it.
okay.
It was an Irish airman foresees his death.
And I
That was the poem she would recite to herself driving from Santa Cruz to Stanford. And what she said, what's that?
Yeah.
I don't know if you're aware of it, but the drive from Stanford, from Santa Cruz to Stanford, is one of the most miserable, terrifying, and dangerous roads in America. Seriously, Highway 17 is ripped.
Yeah.
So, hey,
Yes.
so yes.
That's what I
Visiting your death
gathered,
is
that it
very
was
frightening.
really intense and kind of scary. And she did it, for years. But when she revealed that in an interview, she said it wasn't because she was thinking she was going to die, despite the poem that she chose, but just because of what I was saying a minute ago, the rhythms. There was just the beauty of the poem.
Beautiful.
But Hayden Carruth.
Yeah, and Carruth is interesting to me because when I was working on the collected poems of Bob Kaufman, I found that Carruth was one of the few people to anthologize Bob quite a bit. Didn't forget about him in the 70s, and thought the guy was very fascinating. But she relied on a lot of people for feedback, really wanted that brutal honesty, which is something she provided, to her students and friends alike. But Carruth, they had a very special relationship.
They did. She met him through Denise Levertov, and they immediately clicked as truly dedicated poets. And they mostly were in contact through letters. Of course, they did meet in person. He and his wife and son had a home in Vermont, and eventually, this was while she was married to her husband and had her young sons. Rich and her family bought a property about an hour from Carruth's property. But she learned from him, he learned from her. The relationship, to my eye and mind, evolved into what we would now call an emotional affair. It seemed pretty clear that if he could have pushed it toward an extramarital affair, he would have. It was equally clear that she didn't want that, nor did she want to end the friendship. And after her husband's death, she relied heavily on Hayden to help her through the days that immediately followed. He was part of the search party that went to look for her husband's body once it became clear that he had killed himself. And he went on at Adrienne's request to clean up their home in Vermont, which was near where Alfred Conrad had committed suicide. So he became extraordinarily important to her, not just as a poet friend, but also as just an intimate on whom she could rely. Later, however, once she embraced feminism and it became the core of her identity for many years, she wanted Hayden to pick up the pace and be a feminist right the way, just like she was. And she would get upset because he wasn't there yet, and he wasn't ever going to be where she was as a feminist. And eventually there was a rift, and they were out of touch. And I think it was hurtful for him. He was a fragile man, a brilliant, fragile man. And then when the time came when she was ready to be friends with him again, and by then he had remarried, I think he was very glad for that, as was she. And he came out to California to give a couple of readings, and she and Michelle hosted him and his wife. And there was some, I got some interesting anecdotes about that from his wife. She told me that at one point Hayden was behind the wheel, and she and Adrienne were both in the car, and Hayden, being the sort of erratic fellow that he was just driving crazily fast. And she said that Adrienne had just shrieked at him, "Slow down," to the point where everybody in the car had just jumped up about 2 feet in the air. But they were friends again. And that relationship in some ways is representative of many of her friendships. She often would become very close to someone, in her middle years, especially with her women friends. And then there would be a problem, there would be a rupture, or maybe there would be a problem with that person and with Michelle. And so Adrienne would feel like she needed to back off because Michelle was unhappy. Sometimes Adrienne was able to patch things up and reunite with an old friend or a friend from her early middle years, and sometimes not. So there was a complexity to her friendship with Hayden Carruth that I heard about again and again from many other people.
I know one of from in the book, Denise Levertov was someone that she reconnected with later on in life. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about her friendship with Audre Lorde, a little bit.
Well, Audre Lorde, a black lesbian poet, was an extremely important friend of Adrienne's, and they got to know each other in the 70s. And there were times when they would appear publicly together to model discourse between a black woman and a white woman, and to put on display not just their common ground, but also their differences. And I think that was really unusual and really interesting to do that. In Adrienne's case, she was the more famous at the time. I think now there are a lot of people who may know Lorde's poetry better than they know Rich's, or Lorde might have more name recognition in some circles than Adrienne Rich. They loved each other. I learned that Audre Lorde tried again and again to coax Adrienne into her bed, but Adrienne wasn't having it. And they also disagreed a lot. And there were times when Audre Lorde felt like Adrienne's privilege was sort of getting in the way of her being able to see clearly and to understand clearly issues involving race and race relations. So they had this, again, another complex relationship, writ large, just like the one with Hayden Carruth. I was moved by how hard they tried to be friends, considering the differences. And there are, I think when you study a life closely, as I studied Adrienne Rich's life closely, there are lessons to be learned. And I think one of the lessons I came away with was stick with your friends as best you can. And if there are times when you need to pull back, whether it's for a week or a month or a decade, okay, but if you can circle back, by all means, do so. And so I would just say that they learned from each other a great deal, but the relationship was tumultuous.
This is a little bit of a generic one, but what made writing about Rich so interesting?
Well, I was enthralled with her life story the entire time I was working on it. And that was because her life had a tremendous dramatic arc to it. Many writers live quiet lives, and many writers live academic lives. And so if you're dealing with someone who has mostly been a poet, who's mostly been in academia, it's hard to really tap into the drama in that person's head. It's there. An academic life has its highs and lows, but it's hard to convey all of that, all of the drama of a quiet life. In Rich's case, because of those transformations, because of those multiple comings out that I talked about, to decide, I'm not going to write from a male perspective. I'm going to be a feminist. I'm going to embrace writing from a woman's point of view. I'm going to embrace feminism. I'm going to embrace lesbian feminism. I'm going to embrace my Jewish heritage. She provided dramatic moments. Also, there was the drama of her break from her father. I talked at the beginning about how intense her relationship was with her father, and in some ways he was a bullying influence. Just always, she talked about how he was always hovering over her as a young girl, wanting her to write and to write better, and he would read her poems and critique them. When she married Alfred Conrad, her father objected, and she married him anyway. And so there was a rift, and so that provided drama. Then there was the tragic drama of her husband's suicide. And there was the drama of the friendships. Hayden Carruth, I write about him a lot, Audre Lorde. So I think what really held my attention and what made for such an interesting story was that with a poet, as I was saying a moment ago, there's so much that's just up here that can be really hard to tap into. But in the case of Adrienne Rich, there was external drama that I could write about, and then I could work in my accounts of her poetry and its development in parallel with those external dramatic events.
Yeah, beautiful. This is the teacher in you, what makes Rich relevant today?
I think that there's really a great deal about her life and about her writing that I consider very relevant today. And I don't think we need to look much further than the overturn of Roe v. Wade. If we look back at Rich's message about how women need to take charge of their own lives and recognize that misogyny is real, we're not talking just about sexism. We're talking about real hatred of women and a desire to control women's bodies, women's minds, women's lives. She wrote with anger, with force, with extraordinary eloquence about the importance of women realizing what they were up against and not seeing themselves as victims. Instead, she advocated for taking hold of one's own education, and she held universities and colleges accountable. And even at speeches on the grounds of venerable colleges, she would call those institutions out and say, you need to take women students seriously. The education you've been offering is only half of what needs to be told. You've got to stop lying. You've got to give a truthful account of history and include women's experiences and lives in it. You need to include women's literature. You need to tell this full story, the full truth of what has happened in this world. And I think that if young women, women of all ages, men, young men, men of all ages, read what she said in the 60s, 70s, and later, we can then build on that. We had the Me Too movement, which was powerful and significant, but I don't know how many of those women were familiar with Rich and the feminists of her generation who had so much to offer them, to all of us, not just to them. It's so important to know the recent past, to know the recent language, the eloquent language that can empower and inspire us to do better with our own activism, whatever form it might take, whether it's a letter to the editor, whether it's a book or an article or a conversation with a friend who's thinking, oh, I'm not sure I'm going to vote. I don't think my vote counts. The power of language is what Rich is all about. And I'm not talking about tweets or Facebook or any sort of abbreviated, trivialized form of communication. I'm talking about long-form essays, about poetry that challenges us to think more deeply than we may be accustomed to. All of that is embodied in her life and her art.
Beautiful. Yeah, one of my favorite stories from the book is when she's invited back to Harvard to read. And, it's the same old mess. And she just walks out and takes a stand.
She had no problem just blasting her host, no matter where she might be. And there was some backlash once it became clear that she would sometimes be awarded a great honor, and she would publicly state, I'm not accepting it because I don't respect you. I don't respect what you're about. After that happened a time or two, there were organizations that became hesitant to dole out any more honors to her. That was if you want to call it a price, the price she paid for that sort of radical honesty. She was a Baltimore girl. She knew what good manners looked like and were, but she was a radicalized lesbian feminist who was not going to shy away from speaking her fullest truth. And if it got her in a little bit of trouble, what did she care? It got the word out. One thing, if you don't mind my just introducing a topic.
Yeah.
She went through a phase where when she would give poetry readings in the 1970s, where the audience would assemble and then she would say, I don't want men in this room, and so you're going to have to leave. And so then there would be all of this grumbling and rumbling. The guys wouldn't want to leave, and it might be, say, at a college campus. And I had one person tell me that sometimes the debate over what should then happen, whether the boys and the men should leave or not, would take longer than the poetry reading itself. So maybe that was a way for Rich to conserve her energy. But people have said to me, well, I think that's terrible that she did that. I liked the book, but I thought that was awful. But you think she was going through a modified separatist phase in her life. She never cut off all men. A couple points, though, about that decision to attempt to have single-sex poetry readings just with women. You think of all the male separatism that's gone unacknowledged for centuries. The male clubs, the golf clubs, the social clubs, the fraternities. No women. What is that if not separatism? And yet nobody better than I the predominance of these wealthy, exclusive male colleges, male separatism at its finest. She was trying to create an environment where she could, for 1 hour at a time, read poetry that was about women's lives, for women, and by extension for men, but let's just stick with the women for a moment. And she wanted to give the women in the audience the opportunity to reflect and not worry about a boyfriend nudging them, or getting to the question and answer part of the event and having a guy stick up his hand right away and ask something that would just throw off the dynamics of the whole event. She'd had it happen so many times where there would be someone, a provocateur, who would try to sort of pretend like he didn't understand. And she would respond politely but firmly to whatever the question was. But for a brief moment, she wanted to just change that dynamic, and she didn't do it for long. But I think that the people who attended those readings probably remembered those occasions and thought about that event more than they would have if she just stood up there and read her poems.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, because with her intelligence, she had a couple doors opened. Like, so when she came back to, at Harvard, I mean, with the library that was off limits, was it to women that Rich would get access to? Yeah.
Yes. When she was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, after she had graduated, and she had spent a year in Oxford, and then she came back and married her husband, who was a PhD student and then a young economics professor. She was given special access to the poetry collection at Harvard, which generally was only accessible to men. And she knew it was a great privilege, and she took advantage of it. But later on, she thought back about the tokenism and just for her, just the outrage of it. So she realized in her middle years that in some ways she had been a token, that her early acclaim as a poet had a lot to do with the fact that there were male poets who had decided to let her be a member of their club, so to speak. She wrote beautiful metrical poetry. That those early poems were wonderful and very teachable. They entranced poetry scholars. Randall Jarrell, for instance, loved the early Rich, and there were others. But she decided she wanted to break out of that mold, do some different things with her poetry and with her life. And at that point, in the 70s, she decided to renounce and to identify that period in her life when she felt that, and she was right, that she had been a token. I titled the book The Power of Adrienne Rich in part because she struggled with the power that she had been given, the advantages of her life, of her station in life. And she also recognized that with that power came responsibility, and that the flip side of the power was a great deal of vulnerability. That there's always a time when you can have the rug pulled out from under you. The men who've said, "You're one of us, you're great," can turn on you. She realized that that's the one of the dark dimensions of tokenism, that you're never safe. She realized in the women's movement that she was influential, but she didn't want to cling to her power so tightly that it became a threat or a problem. She didn't want to be worshipped. She wanted respect, which she had certainly earned. But power, just like fire, like flame, is empowering, and it's also risky, and she saw both sides of that. And that's what I really wanted to get at with the title, with the complexity of power.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we could go on for days and days, but I want to open it up to the audience now in case anybody has a question they'd like to ask.
I don't quite know how to put this clearly and succinctly, but do you think that misogyny comes from the fear, the unacknowledged fear by most men that the patriarchy is a reality, but it's also a death sentence? The only example I can come up with is that in terms of species survival, a tribe that has 9 women and 1 man is far more likely to live long and prosper than a tribe that has 9 men and 1 woman. Am I making any sense?
Well, that's food for thought.
That is a...
I guess that's all I can
Misogyny, I suppose you can go many different ways with it. That comes back to power, and I'm speaking for myself now, not for Rich. I think but it connects with what I was saying about her. It's hard to let go of any power that you have or think you have, and so if you feel that by say if you're a male professor and you've always taught just books by men, and now someone's telling you know what, you really need to be knowledgeable about women authors too, and you need to teach an equal number of books by men and women. If you've never done that, and you really don't know anything about women's literature, and many of the male scholars of Rich's time when she was in college and later on really didn't know anything about women's literature. They hadn't bothered to learn it. And so they might have felt a little afraid or a little bit stupid. But then the next step is to think, well, no, I'm not stupid. She's stupid. And so power does not have to be a zero-sum game, but I think for many people, that's how it feels. And on a societal level, for misogyny to ever end, it would take, as Rich herself said, just a radical re-envisioning of relationships on an individual level between, a man and a woman. So that's what I have to say about misogyny on this particular evening in the year
Do you
2022.
think that's happening, that rearrangement, that rethinking of relationships?
I think that it has happened on an individual level, and I think with younger people, I have seen it. We all have friends who have partnerships that are happy and equal. I think on a societal level, we are going the wrong way. And again, look at what happened with the Supreme Court and Roe v. Wade. And there are many other instances we could all point to. But if that's not a deal breaker, I don't know what is. If that doesn't shout misogyny, I don't know what does.
Yeah, definitely. Yes.
I want to say thank you so much, Hilary, and thank you for this great book. I don't know if everyone in the audience has read it, but if you haven't, this is a phenomenal biography.
Yes.
It's so wonderfully fair and judicious, and I say that as someone who knew Adrienne Rich and knew Michelle and knew the whole gang for a long time, and I was just immensely impressed when I read The Power of Adrienne Rich to see how deftly you had woven through the various pitfalls. So thank you. My question is, and it came up in some of the reviews of the book, the how to judge Rich's own poetry over the long arc of her career that you describe. I think there was a review, I think in the London Review of Books, and it was titled, "Was Adrienne Rich a Poet?"
Wow.
And, well, the point being, in a sort of Helen Bendlerish way, that as she became a political writer, her poetry became less good somehow. I mean, this is one of the stories that people in the world of criticism, people like Helen Bendler, have told for a long time. And I have to say, when I look back at something like Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law, I think, this is so wonderful, this is perfect, and then I read some of her very last books. I think there's some truth that her politics overpowered her muse in ways that became, for me, problematic. That she became so dogmatic in her feminism that it marred, in some degree, her artistic achievement. And I just wonder where you are, because I couldn't tell from your book where
Good
you
job.
stood in this hideous hairball of opinion.
A hairball of opinion. As a cat owner, that resonates with me more than I would like to admit.
Yeah, maybe throwing up a hairball. That's what I'm doing. But I found her a magnificent woman, and much of her writing is magnificent. And I agree with you on her importance, absolutely. But I think she lost the music. So.
Well, I to that I would say that for me personally, her early poems really, even her very first book, A Change of World, which she published, it won the Yale Younger Poets Prize when she was still an undergraduate at Radcliffe. I think that book has some really beautiful poems in it. She got off to a tremendous start, and to say it was a precocious start undersells, I think, the maturity of many of the poems in that first collection. When she published in the 70s, Diving into the Wreck, and then a few years later, The Dream of a Common Language, she had reached a pinnacle, certainly. And I talked to women who said that when Rich would have a new collection of poetry coming out during that time period, that they would run to their local bookstore to buy it, that she was that prominent, and she read so widely that if they lived almost anywhere, whether it was New York or some other big city or even a sizable college town, they would have had the chance to hear her read. And she was a fantastic reader of her own work. I attended a couple of her readings long before I realized I would be writing about her. As for the later work, once she moved to Santa Cruz, and she was still writing a lot, publishing a book every few years, even though her health did improve once she moved to California, so it was good that she did that. I would say that as I was writing the book and writing the last third of it and rereading those books, and
Yeah.
to be completely candid, reading some of them for the first time, I I felt that I could see what she was doing. I could see why it was important to her. She wanted to write long poems, and it's hard unless you have this sort of preordained knowledge of that the long poem you're about to read is really great. If you're about to read Song of Myself and you know Whitman's great and you think, okay, I can do this. But if it's a long poem by Adrienne Rich and you're not sure what it's going to be about, it might feel like a little bit of a slog. I think that if you're looking to really understand the arc of her life, those later books count. And they're not as accessible as the earlier work. Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law, that collection that you mentioned, Terry, or Diving into the Wreck, or The Dream of a Common Language. But there's merit there for those who want to follow Rich and to grasp what she was doing with long poetry and to see how Whitman, for instance, was influencing her and how she was circling back to some early male influences that she had more or less set aside during her middle years. And in her old age, I think she decided, what the heck? I always loved Whitman. I always loved Wallace Stevens. I always loved Yeats. And so and she told other women poets, you need to write long poems. And I think that is significant, that's a way to make a mark. We associate those long poems so often with great male poets. And yet, for a woman to do it, it's a way to stake a claim. Helen Vendler, I greatly respect and admire, but I think she was hard on Rich. I think harder than was necessary.
Well,
and
they had too many things in common, I think.
And I had a little correspondence with her, and she said they would occasionally run into each other, and they were polite, but they never really got to know each other just as friends. But there were critics who were very hard on Rich, and once she came out as a lesbian, she suffered some real backlash for that. I remember, I don't know, I think maybe I did include this in the book, that she had TV appearances that were canceled after she came out. And I remember there was an instance where she was just talking about being a lesbian, I think with a reporter from the Baltimore Sun, and was told, well, we can't use the word lesbian in the newspaper. So that kind of makes it hard for you to get your point across.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
word did they use instead?
They probably just didn't talk about it.
Hold on a second, Neely. Let me get to Jokey real quick.
Yes.
This may sound like a silly question, but when it came to these guys who were supposedly acting like they didn't understand something, how did she know it was that versus them really being stupid?
Well, that's always the question, isn't it?
Because I mean, I don't know if this has anything to do. I work with people with intellectual disabilities and stuff, and actually they're pretty smart. But one of the things I've learned from them is that they're also terribly honest. My favorite thing about them, the young adults I'm working with, and I teach them discretion. And I'll say, okay, keep thinking that. That's true, but don't have to tell a boss at a job they can't handle things like that. You know? And the thing is that what I find is that a lot of the stuff that supposedly normal, educated people do to get by intellectually is
Pretty feeble.
yeah, it's a lot of stimulus response, almost like the paramecia in the water, avoiding the light. I'm just like,
Well, I can give you an example, Jokey. I was in touch with a couple of people who had been involved in a visit Rich had made to a college in Mississippi. And I got a copy of it. Originally was, an old, let's see, video cassette, right?
yeah.
And someone very helpfully had it transferred to DVD, so I was able to watch this. It was a little bit grainy, and it was wonderful. It's one thing if you're performing and you know that it's going to be recorded, and it's a big deal, but this was kind of informal, and yet there was the recording, and so I'm one of the very few people who would be watching this years later. Rich read some challenging poems, and she started the reading by talking about her Southern heritage. So she was connecting with people in the audience who might, I think generally people were very receptive. They had been prepped that she was coming. Lots of students on campus had read her poetry in advance. Nevertheless, when it came time for questions, first question was from a man, and he was saying, well, it sounds like with what you're saying about women rejecting male violence and the patriarchy, that the women they'll become violent. And so that doesn't sound good. Are you suggesting that women should be violent? And of course, it was not at all what she was saying. And then Rich was one of those rare people who could speak in paragraphs. So you could almost just see it typed out as she spoke off the top of her head. And she just very clearly told him that the so-called problem, the fictive problem he was presenting of, Amazonian violence was not the issue. And then she talked about the violence women are subjected to by men. And she laid it out calmly, clearly. You could, even in the grainy video that I was watching, you could still see the fire in her eye. But that's what she was up against. And I think she just got sick of it, just after so many times of having that happen. But generally, nonetheless, she was respectful. And as someone who was a teacher, she did want to educate people. She didn't want to embarrass that person. But she did, and this is borrowing an expression from her father, she wanted to set him straight.
Yeah. Neely, you have something for us?
Yeah, I just got a couple things. I've been wrestling Hilary with the collected poems, and it's such a heavy book. You can it's a book to do exercise with.
Yes,
picking it up.
yes.
And I found myself, and I was acquainted with her. I knew a very good friend of hers to whom she dedicated a book. Helen Smelser.
That's my mom.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh my
Yeah.
God.
Hillary's not gonna- yeah.
The first time Helen was with her at the Cafe Roma in North Beach, and I saw them, and Helen saw me, and I went like this with my hand. I wanted to meet her, and Helen went like that. And the second time, Helen introduced us. And Helen Smelser herself was a fascinating force of nature. At any rate, I started reading Adrienne's book from the end, the last poems, toward the beginning. I feel that she was at the end, and I'm not concerned so much with poetry being long or short. I mean, she worshipped Adrienne Rich. I mean, she worshipped Emily Dickinson, but she never wrote like that, Although I think at the end of her life, she was this great emancipator through language, through words, and she's very difficult for me, and I like that difficulty. That's what makes her successful to me, is that she's so difficult, and because you can wrestle with yourself through that difficulty. Toward the earlier poems are good, but they're very formal, and she went through many years of trying to shake off the formality. And there's a great poem in later life that it was sort of a demarcation point for me, where she writes like the woman in a stroller on a ridge in Santa Cruz. Does that ring a bell? Does that ring a bell at all?
Yeah, I
Say
know
the
that.
line again.
A woman on a stroller and the sea below, and it's a very visual poem, which he didn't do so much. And then after that comes what I'm talking about is this incredible, I think, sort of a metaphysical tinkering, so that especially the last 40 or 50 pages of that collected poems, is to me absolutely magnificent poetry by a great master.
Yes.
And it's some of it's very long lines, very long, but it's also very concentrated.
Yes.
And it's something to sink your mind around, in much the same way we do with the little Dickinson poems, so that it isn't necessarily the meaning that you get from her. What you get from her is feeling. And in a sense, that's what she was doing with feminism and all these other areas where she struck out. She was a person of such intense feeling, and the more we can look at a poet that way, through feeling, and then the meaning can come later. And that's how I feel. Speaking of feeling.
I would add to that, though, that she was a woman of great intellect, and I think sometimes women are dismissed as just having all these feelings and emotions. For her, it was definitely both. And the intellectual power of her poetry is there throughout that arc. The last poems that you have referred to are fabulous. And she was writing practically on her deathbed.
Yeah, right.
And that shows that lifelong dedication to the art form. And this was a woman who had had so many physical ailments, and yet it's so moving to think that to the last she was dedicated to transforming her life and experience into art. And those very last poems are short. I don't know that she would have been consciously thinking about Emily Dickinson at that point. Dickinson was among many, many important influences and poets she revered.
Hilary, it's precisely the intellectual prowess, I didn't express it right maybe, of the last poems, because when I say difficult, I mean it's just so, it has so many layers that you can trail onto and go to your own conclusion about, and it's one line after another, and you do get that feeling toward the very end that this is it for her.
Yes.
And she knows it, and she lets you know, and it just strikes home so beautifully. So there you go.
Nice. Well, I think we might have time for one more if anybody has anything else they'd like to ask. George?
This comes as a sort of afterthought, but from Herbert Huncke to Adrienne Rich is quite a phenomenal contrast. I mean, when you think of the different types of personalities that they were and the contribution that they made. And I was wondering, how does that affect your practice of the craft of biography as it is right now? I mean, has it changed? Do you have, I mean, the tone of the first book is very, very different. I mean, in terms of your writing from what's happening now. And I wonder if you had anything that you could say about that.
Herbert Huncke was a thief and a heroin addict and a con artist. He was also
Adrienne.
He was also, I think, a really good writer and a raconteur, a wonderful conversationalist. When I wrote about him, I no one had written a full-length biography of him. I thought he was so interesting. I felt like he needed a biography, that this was a part of the Beat movement story that hadn't been told and needed to be told. I learned a lot about writing a biography by writing about him. And because he was a humorous fellow, I am somewhat humorous at times in my writing about him. It lent itself to that. When I got into writing about Rich, she had a sense of humor, but her life story was very serious. And it seemed that always so much was at stake. So I would say that I didn't have the same opportunity for humor, and my writing is different. It really is. I would say I was aiming for something a little higher than I was with the Hunky book, because I felt that it was demanded of me by the complexity and the intellectual rigor of Rich's own life.
One follows function.
Very good.
Yeah.
And I, just as a PS, whenever there were any humorous moments that I came across in writing about Rich, I would grab onto them and throw them right in the book whenever I could.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm curious, did you end up liking her at the end? I mean, after all this thinking and reading and listening and talking, I mean, what do you...
I remember when I was in graduate school and I had Linda Wagner Martin as a professor at the University of North Carolina, and Linda is a biographer who at that point had just published a big biography of Sylvia Plath. And she said, when you write biography, you have to love your subject, because otherwise it's just not going to work. I would say that I love Rich. I really do. I don't know that she and I would have been friends if I had known her. I suspect that we would not have been. It's a question I've asked myself pretty often. I think if she had met me and known that I wanted to write about her, that could have, talking to the hand. I think that it's possible to have a sort of deep platonic respect and love for your biographical subject, and as Linda said all those many years ago, and that in fact it's really essential. I'm sure you've read biographies where you came away disliking the subject of the biography because there are so many anecdotes that just made it clear that the person was a jerk. And you just say, I can't stand this person. And that's on the biographer if the person comes off as just really dislikable. You have to aim for a story that allows for the multifaceted dimension of a person and the complexity of the life. May I just say a word about Tina's mother, about Helen Smelser?
Yes, please.
Which book is it that's dedicated?
Sources.
Sources is dedicated to Tina's late mother, Helen Smelser. And so when I was, sort of midway through my research, I kept looking at that dedication for Helen Smelser after all these years, I think it is.
Since 1949.
Since 1949. And I would think, well, I wonder who Helen Smelser was. And I Googled the name, and I didn't find anything, and I set it aside. And then 2 or 3 years later, I Googled again, and maybe I used whitepages.com, and I found a number, called, I got a voicemail, and then I heard back from Tina, from Helen's daughter. And that launched the beginning of a really wonderful email correspondence where I would write to Tina's mother, and then you would share those questions with her, and she was in assisted living.
Right.
And then Tina would write back to me and report what her mother had said. This went on for a while, and then I came out to San Francisco, and this was on the same trip when I then went to Santa Cruz. I met Tina, and Tina took me to meet her mother in assisted living, and so I had a face-to-face interview with her, which was very helpful, and she was just a lovely lady, and I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to Terry Castle, whom I talked to about your contact with Rich when you were colleagues at Stanford, and I'm really grateful to all the people I got to know and who helped me with this book. You can't do it by yourself. You have to depend on so many people when you've decided to make interviews a big part of the book. You have to rely on the help of the kindness of people who are willing to take a risk, because you don't know what the final book will look like. But at any rate, I'm grateful to your mom and to you.
And I
and
can
to
just
Terry.
add to that it was such an important thing for my mom, because she had moved to assisted living, was kind of frail, and just was sort of feeling what was her purpose. And so then all of a sudden out of the air was like, here's this woman writing a book about Adrienne, you know, would you like to answer some questions? And so it really gave her such an important focus and a feeling like she had a function, and helped her remember those times.
How
And so
did they know one another? What was
they
the
met at
context?
Radcliffe.
Oh,
She was a year older, but then they kept in touch through all the years. And I remember Hilary asking my mother, well, what would you and Adrienne do together? And my mother was like, we talked. We had conversations. Like, they went to cafes and talked. They didn't like go do it.
They just talk.
We went to the mall.
They talked
Yeah.
right. They
Yeah.
talked on the phone, and Adrienne was so generous in later years when my mother was talking to very few people that she would, you know, they would through email, they would make appointments to talk on the phone.
I remember you said that
Yeah.
Adrienne would set phone dates with your
Yeah.
mother.
That's
Yeah.
beautiful. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Hilary. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for writing the book. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Eric, Burden Beckett.
Thank you. Thanks, Tate.
Thank you. All right. That was great. Yeah. Excellent.
Somehow spilling water all over the room.
Fascinating evening.
Yes.
Thank you, George.
You know, it's like,
And furious.
Oh, thank you so much.
more, I mean, obviously intellectual, but also more passion for the subject.
Yes,
Right? And that's why I got into that little thing with you, because that was such a different kind of
yes.
And, you know, and then I thought, you know, we could change it.
I'm glad you asked that, because Tate and I have been talking about the transition from the beat